Hey, in this video we'll be talking about blueprints in Unreal Engine. So blueprints are a visual scripting language in Unreal Engine. They're visual because you're putting together pieces like blocks and connecting them, unlike kind of writing just normal programming code. And they're a scripting language because they control objects in your game. They script them, they tell them what to do. So kind of like a movie script. These blueprints are equivalent to writing code to drive the mechanics of your games, but there's a lot less memorization and the connections between the objects and the data can be made more clear. The first step in understanding blueprints is that it works by connecting nodes. Each node is kind of like a tool, and you can connect these tools together to form a process where things get done the way that you planned for your game. For example, you might use a node that detects when the player presses their jump button. Connect that node to another node that sends the player up into the air, and suddenly you have jumping in your game. There are two kinds of blueprints, level and class blueprints. Level blueprints are specific to the scene that you're working in, or the stage, or level. This is for special triggers that you might make effects happen in a stage, or for events that only happen in a particular screen in your game. Class blueprints are the other type, and they're actually a little bit more common. You can think of a class, that word, as a group of things that are similar in some way. If we put a jumping mechanic into a class blueprint, then we could make multiple objects from it. Each object made from that class blueprint would then jump together when you press the jump button. When working with blueprints, we have to think about the kind of data that's passed around between those nodes. Each type of data has a special name, and you might already be familiar with some of them. In that jumping example, the first node needs to know the answer to a question. Did the player press the jump button? Well, that's kind of like a yes or no question. That kind of data can be represented as true or false, and we call that kind of data Boolean. So a Boolean piece of data can have exactly one of two different values, either true or false. And that can be really useful for when you're making decisions in your game, when your program has to make a choice. If we wanted to control how high the jump was, we'd have to provide a different kind of data. A height, or maybe the force or upward speed of a jump, can be described with just a normal rational number. We usually work with two types of these normal numbers. One is called a floating point number, or just float for short. And with floats, they are used to store decimal numbers. So numbers like 4.15 or 0.0 are stored well as floating point numbers. And the floating point number name kind of comes from the idea of how they're stored. That decimal point can move around within the number depending on how large or small the number is, kind of like in scientific notation. Another type of number is an integer, or int for short. Integers, just like in math class, can only be whole numbers. There are no decimal points. So they can store things like 7 or 0 or negative 12. They can be positive or negative, but they cannot have a decimal point. Their simplicity makes them useful for certain things that you wouldn't want to use floating point numbers for. So like if you're counting a number of characters on the screen, a decimal value might not make sense for that, but a whole number, an integer, would. Alright, well, in the next video, let's take a dive into blueprints. Let's look at what they seem like in the engine, and let's make that simple jumping blueprint. See you then.